All right, let's dive in. We're going to kick things off with a number, and it's a pretty big one. Over 370.
370.
Yep, 370. That's the number of times, get this, between May 2023 and September 2024 that foreign squid fishing vessels, those huge industrial ones, entered Peruvian ports.
Oh, wow.
The catch, they didn't have the required satellite monitoring in place.
That's not good.
It's a huge red flag, right?
Yeah.
And it points to a much bigger problem, and that's IUU fishing, illegal, unreported, and unregulated fishing.
Yeah, IUU fishing, that's a serious issue.
Yeah.
I mean, it's not just a few boats skirting the rules, it's a global problem with some pretty devastating consequences.
Exactly. We're talking massive economic damage, not just for Peru, but for coastal communities worldwide. Then there's the environmental side. I mean, IUU fishing decimates ocean ecosystems.
Right, it's like taking a sledgehammer to the delicate balance of the ocean.
Yeah.
And we're also talking about human rights, right? There's a strong link between IUU fishing and worker exploitation, even forced labor in some cases.
Absolutely. So, with all that in mind, today we're going deep on a working paper that dives into the challenges of keeping tabs on these distant water squid fishing vessels, the ones using Peruvian ports.
Using Peruvian ports.
And the focus is on a specific piece of Peruvian legislation, Decree Supreme 014-2024-Produce. This decree, it's all about trying to combat IUU fishing by putting stricter controls on how these vessels can enter Peruvian waters.
So Peru's trying to tighten the reins.
They are, but, and this is where it gets interesting, it's way more complex than just saying, hey, follow the rules. This whole thing, it involves international agreements, technology, and a whole lot of politics.
Sounds messy.
It kind of is.
Yeah.
And here's why you, as a listener, should care. The giant squid fishery, it's a huge deal for Peru. We're talking over 50,000 jobs and, get this, up to $850 million in exports annually.
Wow, $850 million. That's a significant chunk of their economy.
It is. Now, add to that the fact that just last year, 2024, the Peruvian fishing industry had a major crisis.
A crisis, really.
Yeah, landings plummeted by 65%. That led to seafood prices skyrocketing, like more than double what they were before.
Oof, that's gotta hurt.
It did. And it's put the spotlight squarely on these issues. Are foreign fleets being held to the same standards as Peruvian vessels? Because there's this public perception, and you see it in the media, of unequal treatment.
So there's a fairness issue as well.
Exactly. So how's Peru tackling this? Well, this new decree, it lays out two paths for foreign vessels to get access to Peruvian ports. Path 1, the regular procedure, involves installing Peru's own satellite monitoring system. It's called CISAT.
CISAT.
Then there's Path 2, the alternative procedure, and they call this one homologation. So on the surface, both of them, they sound like, reasonable solutions, right?
Sure, two options. Makes sense.
But each one, as we're going to explore, comes with its own set of hurdles, challenges, questions. So let's start with the regular procedure, the CISAT one.
Okay, CISAT it. Let's unpack that.
All right, so the core idea here is pretty straightforward. Foreign squid vessels that fish for what they call transzonal resources.
Transzonal, so fish that migrate across different boundaries, right?
Exactly, like the giant squid. These stocks, they move across national and international waters, which makes them really susceptible to IU fishing because it's so hard to track them, to enforce rules across all those different zones.
Makes sense. Tricky to manage.
Very tricky. So these vessels, the ones fishing for transzonal resources, they have to use the Peruvian satellite monitoring system, CISAT, specifically the VMS, the Vessel Monitoring System equipment.
VMS, that's like a GPS tracker for ships, right?
It is, and it's not a brand new thing either. Peru actually made it mandatory back in 2020.
Oh, so they tried it before?
They did, but let's just say compliance wasn't exactly a top priority for some vessels.
Okay, so this new decree, it's basically doubling down on that requirement.
It is, and they're getting very specific about how it needs to be done. Like the VMS, it has to be operational, fully up and running for a full 6 months.
6 months? That's a long time.
It is, and that's 6 months before the vessel can even request entry into a Peruvian port.
Wow, so they're serious about tracking these vessels.
They are. Now, there is a bit of a loophole, or maybe it's more like a controlled entry point. A vessel can request a first-time entry just to install the CISAT equipment.
Okay. So a one-time entry just for the install.
But even then, they have to provide a full 12 months of prior location data.
So no sneaking in under the radar.
Nope. Peru wants a full history of where these boats have been, and to make absolutely sure no one skips out, Peru's Coast Guard, DCAPI, They won't issue a departure certificate, the ZARP.
ZARP, that's the official permission to leave, right?
Exactly. They won't issue it without confirmation from Produce, the Ministry of Production, that, yep, the CISAT equipment is installed and working. No leaving port without it.
So it's like, show us your tracking data, or you're staying put.
Exactly. But the rules, they don't start with the vessels themselves. The companies that provide the satellite service and the VMS equipment, they've got to meet some pretty strict criteria, too.
Makes sense. Can't have just any fly-by-night company providing the tracking tech.
Right. So first off, these providers, they need to be officially recognized by Produce. They're put on this list. They call it APTOS, which basically means suitable or approved.
APTOS. Got it. So what does it take to get on this approved list?
Well, to even apply, they have to be legally established in Peru. That means either being a Peruvian company or a registered branch of a foreign company.
Okay, so there's a legitimacy check right off the bat.
Yep. Then comes the application process itself, and that's where things get a bit more involved. There's a full-on evaluation, technical and legal, followed by a very detailed testing procedure.
So they don't just take anyone's word for it?
Nope. The company, they have to submit their application to a specific department within Produce, the General Directorate of Supervision, Inspection, and Sanctions.
Long name.
It is, and this directorate, they get support from Produce's General Office of Information Technology. The whole process, it follows a set of instructions laid out in Directive N-01-2019, Produce TGSFS-PA.
Sounds very official.
It is, but here's a twist. Even before Produce gets involved, the satellite equipment itself, the hardware, it has to go through this other process called homologation.
Homologation, that's like getting certified, right?
It is, and it's done by the Ministry of Transport and Communications, the MTC.
The MTC? Wait, so a whole different ministry is involved.
They are, and it's all mandated under this other decree, Supreme Decree, N-001-2006 MTC.
So hold on. Why is the MTC involved in this? Why do they get to weigh in on fishing vessels?
It's not specifically about the fishing, it's about the technology. The MTC, their job is to make sure any telecommunications equipment used in Peru meets certain technical standards.
Okay, so it's like a safety and compatibility check for anything that transmits signals.
Exactly. They want to prevent damage to networks, make sure the equipment is safe for users and operators, prevent interference, and ensure that the radio frequency spectrum is being used properly.
So like a quality control for anything transmitting data.
Exactly. And only the equipment that passes their review gets this official MTC certificate of homologation.
Certificate of homologation. That sounds important.
It is. You can't import, sell, or even use the equipment in Peru without it.
Wow. So it's a pretty big deal. So once a company has that MTC certificate, then they go back to Produce.
That's right. Produce picks up the evaluation process from there.
And what does that involve?
It's a two-stage process. First, Produce. They do a deep dive into all the documentation, all the technical and legal stuff the provider submitted. If that all checks out, then they move on to stage 2.
Stage 2.
And that's physical testing. They actually test the equipment itself. They do lab tests, controlled environment to examine the components, how it functions.
Okay. So making sure it actually does what it's supposed to do.
Yep. But they also do field tests, out in the real world to see how it performs under actual operating conditions. And these tests, they're all laid out in Annex 2 of the CISAT regulations. They cover all sorts of things, like checking how often the position signal is transmitted.
Oh, so they're checking if it's reporting its location frequently enough.
Exactly. It has to send a signal every 10 minutes. They also test the geographic and technical alerts, making sure those work properly.
So if a vessel enters a restricted area, or if there's a malfunction, the system should flag it.
Exactly. They even measure the message latency, how long it takes for the signal to be sent and received. And get this, they do stress tests on the equipment.
Stress tests, like shaking it around, dropping it.
Pretty much. They want to make sure it's durable, that it can handle tough conditions out at sea.
It's pretty thorough. Makes sense, though, given the importance of this data.
Absolutely. Now, you might be wondering, isn't all VMS equipment the same? But it's not. There are different classes, and the one these foreign industrial vessels are required to use is Class A.
Class A.
And that's the highest standard. The same level of equipment that Peruvian industrial fishing vessels have to use, Produce, they actually categorize the satellite equipment into 3 classes, A, B, and C.
3 classes. So A is the top tier, the most sophisticated.
It is. And Class A systems, they've got a lot of bells and whistles. Like, they have to be able to store at least 10,000 positioning data records.
10,000. That's a lot of data points.
It is. And the storage, it has to be non-volatile, which means it keeps that data even if the power goes out.
So no losing data if there's a power interruption. Smart.
Very smart. They also have two-way communication. So it's not just the vessel sending out its location. It can also receive messages, instructions.
So they can communicate with the vessel through the VMS. Interesting.
Yep. And then there's the geofencing capability. This allows them to create virtual boundaries, around protected areas, restricted zones, anchorages, landing points.
So they can set up these virtual fences, and if a vessel crosses them, boom, they get an alert.
Exactly. It's a really powerful tool for enforcement, making sure vessels stay where they're supposed to be.
So this Class A system, it's not just about basic tracking. It's about actively monitoring and enforcing the rules.
It is. It's designed to catch any funny business, whether it's turning off the GPS or trying to tamper with the equipment itself.
So lots of data, lots of security features. What else do these Class A systems provide?
Well, they go beyond just location data. They record and transmit alerts for all sorts of events, like if someone tries to tamper with the equipment, block the satellite signal, or remove the unit.
Wow, so they're really trying to cover all the bases.
Yep. And the data security is taken very seriously. All the information, it's encrypted using AES-256, which is a very strong encryption standard.
So preventing hackers from messing with the data.
Exactly. And maybe the most crucial part, these systems, they automatically send real-time alerts to the CISAT control center if anything unusual happens.
Anything unusual? Like what?
Like if the system is turned on or off at an unexpected time, if the GPS signal gets blocked, any system failures, if someone tries to access the configuration settings without authorization, even if the unit is physically disassembled.
So it's like a tattletale system reporting any suspicious activity.
It is. And then, to add an extra layer of physical security, these Class A units, they have to have tamper-evident seals.
Seals, like physical seals on the equipment.
Yep. And these seals, they can only be applied or removed by inspectors who are specifically accredited by Produce. So no one can mess with the equipment without it being noticed.
That's pretty clever. So it sounds like this regular procedure with the CISAT installation, it's designed to be very thorough, very reliable.
It is. And it creates a level playing field, both for national and foreign vessels, ensuring a consistent stream of high-quality data, which is what you need to effectively combat IUU fishing.
Right. It's all about transparency and accountability. But now let's switch gears and talk about the other option, the alternative procedure, the homologation.
Yeah, homologation. It sounds a bit more flexible, right? Like maybe a bit easier for foreign flag states.
Maybe. So the way it's outlined in this decree, in the second final complementary provision of Decree Supreme N 014 T014 produce a foreign flag state.
Like the government of a country whose vessels are fishing in these waters.
Exactly. They can formally request to have their vessels' existing VMS signals homologated.
Homologated. So basically, make them compatible with Peru's CISAT system.
That's the idea. So instead of installing the Peruvian CISAT equipment, they're saying, hey, our existing systems, they're good enough. Let's just make them talk to your system.
And if this homologation request is approved, these foreign vessels could potentially enter Peruvian ports without having to install the CISAT equipment.
So potentially a shortcut, a workaround.
Maybe. But remember, you mentioned some concerns about this homologation process.
Oh, yeah. There are some definite red flags. Two main areas of concern, actually. One, there was no public consultation about this homologation option.
No public consultation. So no one got a chance to weigh in on this before it was included in the decree.
Nope. And they also didn't do what's called an ex-ante regulatory impact analysis, or AR ex-ante, specifically for this part of the decree.
AR ex-ante. That sounds pretty technical. Remind me, what are those and why are they so important?
Right. So public consultation, that's a crucial part of good governance. It's basically a way for the government to say, hey, everyone, we're thinking of implementing this new rule. What do you think?
So giving people, businesses, organizations a chance to comment, raise concerns.
Exactly. It helps the government understand the potential impacts, gather different perspectives, and ultimately make sure the final rule is effective and fair.
Makes sense. About the AR ex-ante.
Right. So the AR ex-ante, that's even more formal. It's a systematic analysis that the government's supposed to do before they implement any big new regulation.
So it's like a deep dive into the problem and potential solutions.
Yep. They define the problem, then they look at all the different options for solving it, both regulatory and non-regulatory, using data and evidence.
So it's about making informed decisions, weighing the pros and cons.
Exactly. And these two processes, they often work hand in hand to make sure regulations are well thought out and effective. In Peru, This usually involves the PCM, the Presidency of the Council of Ministers, and sometimes they need approval from the CCV, the Vice Ministerial Coordination Commission.
So with this decree, with this homologation part, did they skip these steps?
They did. Back in July 2024, Produce, they approved the initial draft of this decree through Ministerial Resolution N Degree 286-2024 Produce. And that draft, it only focused on installing the CSAT equipment. No mention of homologation at all.
Okay.
Then they did the standard 15-day public consultation period.
So people had a chance to comment on the CSAT part.
They did. And they got 58 comments from all sorts of stakeholders, the fishing industry, NGOs, the CAPI, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, you name it.
Wow, 58 comments.
Produce reviewed all of them, even published a response matrix. But here's the kicker. None of those comments even mentioned homologation.
So it wasn't even on the radar at that point?
Nope. Then, after the consultation, Produce sent the draft to the PCM for review by the CMCR, the Multisectoral Commission for Regulatory Quality.
Lots of acronyms.
I know, right? But the point is, the CMCR, they gave a thumbs up to the draft on August 21st, 2024, and that draft still didn't have homologation.
So everything was moving forward without it?
Exactly. And since the decree involved both Produce and the Ministry of Defense, because of the CAPIA, it should have gone to the CCV next.
But that's not what happened.
Nope. When the final version was published on September 24, 2024, boom, there it was, homologation, as the second final complementary provision.
So it just appeared out of nowhere?
Pretty much.
Yeah.
Bypassed the whole public consultation, the ex ante, everything.
Wow, that's a pretty big procedural misstep.
It is, and it raises serious concerns about the legitimacy and effectiveness of this homologation path. I mean, the CMCR approved a version without it, and suddenly it's in the final decree.
So skipping these steps, what are the potential legal ramifications?
Well, a few things could happen. Produce, they could actually repeal this homologation provision because, according to Article 6 of Decree Legislative N 1565, which is the law that requires the ex ante.
So they could just scrap it?
They could. Or someone could challenge it in court through what's called a popular action or action popular under the new Constitutional Procedural Code.
So a legal challenge could knock it out?
Yep. And the officials who allowed this to happen, they could face administrative penalties, according to Peru's civil service law.
So there's a lot of potential legal fallout. But beyond the legal issues, what about the practical burden of this homologation process?
Right, because they skipped the ex ante. They didn't analyze how difficult it would be for foreign states to actually go through with this homologation. And there's the question of whether this undermines the whole idea of using Peruvian providers with their high standards.
So the way it was introduced, it's legally shaky, to say the least. But even if those legal hurdles are cleared, are there practical challenges to making the system actually work?
Definitely. So despite all these concerns, homologation is technically part of the law now. But the original decree, it was pretty vague on the details of how it would work.
So how do you actually do this homologation thing?
Right. Luckily, they released Ministerial Resolution N 0438-2024 Produce in November 2024, and that provided some clarification.
Okay, so a little more guidance.
Yep.
Yeah.
According to Article 3 of this resolution, homologation will happen by connecting Produce's CESTAT Control Center with the foreign flag state's own Fisheries Monitoring Center.
So they're basically trying to link up the two systems.
Exactly. The idea is to share the data, and the foreign state has to prove that their data meets the same standards as CISASAT. And Produce is supposed to release even more specific guidelines in the future.
Okay, so data sharing sounds good in theory, but what are the technical and legal roadblocks here?
Well, there are several. First, the existing CISASAT regulations, those were established by Supreme Decree N Degree 001-2014 Produce, and they apply to Peruvian fishing permit holders and the registered CISASAT providers.
So Peruvian vessels, foreign vessels with Peruvian permits, and the companies providing the tracking service in Peru.
Yep. But this new resolution, Ministerial Resolution N Degree 0438-2024 Produce, it says foreign flag states need to follow those CISASAT rules for homologation.
That sounds like a problem.
It is. It's essentially trying to expand the scope of the original CISASAT regulations using a lower-level legal instrument.
So a ministerial resolution can't override a supreme decree.
Exactly. It violates this legal principle called normative supremacy. You can't just change the rules for a whole new group of actors using a lower-level regulation. It's like trying to change the Constitution with a local ordinance.
Okay, I get it. So legally, that's a no-go. What's the next challenge?
The second one is the big question of whether homologation can actually meet the technical specifications of CSAT. This resolution says they need to, but it's a tall order.
So even if they manage to share the data, is the data itself good enough?
Exactly. And remember, the CSAT regulations, they're designed for Peruvian companies that go through a very strict approval process. They use specific equipment that's been pre-approved by the MTC, and they follow a whole set of security protocols. It's a tightly controlled system.
Right. So how do you make sure a foreign system, which might be completely different, can measure up?
That's the million-dollar question. And there are several key aspects of CSAT that are really tough to replicate. Like, one core principle is that the service has to be provided by a company based in Peru.
So they can't just use any provider they want.
Nope. It has to be a company that Produce can directly regulate, enforce standards on, and even penalize if they don't comply.
Ah, so it's about control and accountability.
Exactly. Another big one is the security seals. Remember those tamper-evident seals that are physically attached to the equipment?
Yeah, to prevent anyone from messing with it.
Right. Well, the current CSAT framework, it doesn't have any way to apply or monitor those seals on vessels that are using homologated foreign VMS.
So a potential security gap.
Big time.
Mhm.
And if those seals aren't there, you can't really guarantee the data is reliable.
Mhm.
Someone could be tampering with the equipment, manipulating the data, and Produce wouldn't necessarily know.
That completely defeats the purpose of having a monitoring system.
It does. Then there's the whole MTC authorization thing. Remember, any VMS equipment has to be certified by the MTC before it can be used in Peru.
Right, that's to protect the networks and national security.
Exactly. So how do you apply that to a foreign system that might not have gone through that process? It's a logistical and potentially political nightmare.
A lot of headaches.
A lot. And then there's that rule about providers not being able to hold fishing permits in the same fishery they're monitoring.
Right, to avoid conflicts of interest.
Yep. That could be a huge issue for some foreign fleets, especially those from countries where the government is involved in vessel ownership or VMS technology.
Like China, for example.
Exactly. And then there's the question of enforcement. If a homologated system isn't compliant, who gets penalized? The foreign state or the individual vessel owner?
Yeah.
And how do you actually collect fines from entities that aren't based in Peru?
Yeah, lots of practical enforcement issues.
Tons. So the bottom line is, while the resolution wants these homologated systems to meet CSAT standards, there's no clear legal or technical framework to make that happen.
So it's like a good idea on paper, but in practice, it's full of holes.
Exactly. They really need to amend both the original decree and the CSAT regulations to make homologation work properly. They need to define clear procedures, specific sanctions, and a way to guarantee compliance.
Okay, so homologation, even on a technical level, it's got a long way to go. But you also mentioned a concern about the legal instruments they're using to define these procedures.
Oh yeah, that's a whole other can of worms. It boils down to the difference between internal directives and actual legal norms.
Okay, break that down for me.
So in Peru, they have these internal directives, which are basically guidelines for how government agencies do their internal work.
So like a rule book for the agency itself.
Yep. And these directives, they're explicitly not supposed to regulate citizens or private companies. They're just for internal use.
Got it.
But this new resolution, it says that Produce is going to issue a directorial resolution with guidelines for evaluating homologation requests.
So they're trying to use an internal directive to regulate something that involves external actors.
Exactly. And that's where the problem lies. These directives, they don't have the legal way to do that.
So it's like trying to enforce a school dress code on people who don't even go to that school.
Exactly. To properly regulate something like homologation, they need a legal norm, something like a supreme decree or a ministerial resolution that's been through public consultation in all the proper channels.
Ah, okay. So they're using the wrong tool for the job.
Exactly. And that creates a lot of uncertainty and potential for legal challenges down the road. It also means they're bypassing the transparency and accountability that comes with proper legal processes.
So it's a messy situation, to say the least. So with all these challenges, what's been the real-world impact of this decree so far? Has it actually deterred these foreign vessels?
Well, in the short term, it seems to have had some effect. Between September and November 2024, right after the decree went into effect, there was a noticeable drop in foreign vessels entering Peruvian ports.
So fewer vessels coming in.
Yep. Now, some of that was probably due to the grace period they announced, but even after that ended, the number stayed relatively low. There was one forced entry because of a medical emergency and a couple of requests that were withdrawn. But overall, it seems like the decree has made some vessels think twice about entering Peruvian waters without the proper monitoring.
So a win for Peru, at least initially.
Maybe, but the long-term picture is less clear. The big problem is the low adoption rate of the regular CICIT procedure and the uncertainty surrounding homologation.
So those loopholes, those unanswered questions, they're creating a risk that this initial deterrent effect might not last.
Exactly. And there are signs that some vessels might be trying to find ways around the decree. For example, between November 2024 and February 2025, we saw something new.
Something new.
Yep. 8 foreign Squid vessels were recorded entering the port of Iquique in Chile, specifically for crew changes. And before this decree, that was pretty unusual.
Now, instead of entering Peru, they're going to a neighboring country.
It seems that way. It could be a way to avoid the Peruvian requirements while still fishing in the same general area.
Interesting. So potentially a loophole?
Maybe. Another possibility is that they're just waiting to see how this homologation thing plays out. They might be hoping it'll be an easier path in the long run.
So a wait-and-see approach.
It's possible. And keep in mind, the peak season for these vessels in Peru is between April and September.
So we might see a lot more activity and a lot more pressure on the homologation process in the coming months.
Exactly. And there's another potential issue here. With homologation being framed as a government-to-government thing, it could shift the focus away from the technical aspects and more towards politics.
So decisions being made based on diplomacy rather than what's best for monitoring and enforcement.
That's the risk. And that would be a huge step backwards. The priority has to be making sure these vessels are properly monitored no matter what flag they fly.
Agreed. So what's the best path forward for Peru?
They really need to go back and amend both the original decree and the CICIT regulations. And they need to do it transparently, with public consultation and a proper error ex ante.
So fix the legal framework, close the loopholes, and make sure any alternative system is just as robust as the regular CICIT procedure.
Exactly. And the good news is Peru has a decent track record of doing this kind of thing. They've recently amended the CICIT regulations several times with public input to improve things like provider registration, technical requirements for smaller vessels, and coverage of the artisanal fleet.
So it can be done.
It can. It just requires political will and a commitment to transparency.
That's a great point. So as we wrap up this deep dive, what are the key takeaways for our listeners?
Yeah. Well, first, this new decree, it's a good start. Peru's taking concrete steps to deter non-compliant vessels.
But
the long-term success depends on how they address the challenges with both the regular CICIT installation and this homologation pathway.
And homologation, it's the area that needs the most work.
Definitely. It's got potential. But right now, it's legally questionable, technically shaky, and lacks transparency.
So a lot of work to do.
Yep. Peru needs to step up and create a system that's robust, transparent, and truly effective in combating IU fishing.
Couldn't agree more. And here's a final thought for our listeners to ponder. This whole situation, it raises some interesting questions, like, could this rush to implement homologation without following the proper procedures actually end up undermining the fight against IU fishing?
It's a valid question.
And what does this tell us about the balance between national interests and international cooperation when it comes to managing our oceans? This whole situation is worth paying attention to, and we encourage everyone to dig deeper into the resources we've talked about today.
Absolutely. The more informed we are, the better equipped we'll be to hold our governments accountable for protecting our oceans.
Couldn't have said it better myself. Thanks for joining us for this deep dive. Until next time, keep exploring, keep asking questions.